No one wanted the Alpha King's scarred daughter, until a rejected Omega sat beside her. The knock on Lyra's door came too early, sharp and impatient, the kind of knock that meant her father had already decided something for her. She did not move from the mirror. Her fingers rested against the raised line of skin that ran from her cheekbone down to her jaw, a path carved into her years ago by claws that were never supposed to reach her. She had stopped flinching at the sight long before, but tonight, with the Unity gathering only an hour away, her stomach twisted anyway. Lyra. Her father's voice came through the wood, steady as ever, the voice of a king who had never once raised it in front of his people. The carriages are ready. I heard you the first time, she called back, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pin that held her hair away from the scarred side of her face. She had learned, over the years, exactly which angles hid the worst of it and which ones did not. Tonight she chose not to hide. She was tired of hiding. Downstairs, the great hall of Ashford Keep buzzed with the low hum of servants preparing for a night that mattered more than any other on the pack calendar. The Unity gathering brought alphas, betas, and omegas from every allied territory under one roof, and King Draven had hosted it for 11 years running, ever since he took the throne from his own father. Lyra had grown up watching torches lit along the stone corridors, watching wolves of every rank bow their heads to her family, watching her mother float through the crowd like she owned the very air in the room. Her mother had died when Lyra was 12. The scars came 4 years after that, during a border skirmish that was never supposed to touch the royal family at all. She remembered very little of the attack itself, only fragments, the smell of smoke, a voice shouting her name, the strange calm that settled over her right before the pain arrived. What she remembered clearly, with a kind of permanent ache, was what came after. The way people looked at her differently, the way potential suitors, who had once lined up outside the keep gates hoping for an introduction, simply stopped coming. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this every single night, and every single night it worked a little less. The carriage ride to the gathering hall took 20 minutes, and her father spent most of it studying a stack of papers rather than looking at her, which she preferred. King Draven was not a cruel man. If anything, his silence came from worry, not indifference. She had caught him staring at her more than once over the past year, his jaw tight, as though he were trying to solve a problem that had no solution. "You look well tonight," he said finally, folding the papers away as the carriage slowed. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true." He met her eyes, and for a moment the king disappeared and only her father remained. "You are still my daughter, Lyra. Nothing that happened to you changes that." She did not answer, because she had heard some version of that sentence 100 times before, and it had never once made the hall of strangers waiting for her feel any less like a gauntlet. The gathering hall was already full when they arrived, torches blazing along both walls, long tables set with more food than any single pack could eat in a week. Lyra walked in beside her father, and the room did what it always did. It noticed her, then it looked away. Conversations paused for half a heartbeat before resuming at a slightly quieter volume. She had learned to recognize the particular texture of that silence, the one reserved for something people found difficult to look at directly. She found a spot near the edge of the hall, close enough to fulfill her duty as the king's daughter, far enough to avoid the center of attention. Alphas from 3 different territories greeted her father with the appropriate bows, their eyes sliding past her as though she were a shadow attached to the king, rather than a person in her own right. A cluster of young women her age laughed together near the dessert table, and none of them so much as glanced her way. She had once been friends with 2 of them. She poured herself a cup of spiced wine, and let her gaze drift across the hall, searching for anything interesting enough to distract her from the familiar sting. That was when she noticed him. He sat alone at the far end of one of the long tables, near enough to the group of other Omegas that he should have belonged, far enough that he clearly did not. He was not eating. He simply sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, watching the room the way a person watches weather they cannot control. Something about his posture struck her, not the slump of someone defeated, but the careful stillness of someone who had learned to make himself smaller so the room would leave him alone. She did not know him. She would have remembered a face like that, sharp-boned and quiet, dark hair falling slightly over his brow. He wore the plain gray of a traveling Omega rather than the colors of any specific pack, which was unusual for a gathering this formal. Most Omegas came dressed in their pack's crest, proud of their lineage, even if their rank kept them from the center of power. "Who is that?" she asked one of the serving girls passing with a tray of bread. The girl followed her gaze, then quickly looked away, lowering her voice. "That's Kian Voss, my lady. He arrived with the delegation from Rivermore, but I wouldn't get too close if I were you." "Why not?" The girl hesitated, clearly weighing how much gossip was appropriate to share with the king's daughter, then apparently decided the pull of a good story was too strong to resist. There was an incident. Back home, his fated mate rejected him, right there in front of the whole pack. Everyone's talking about it. Some people say an Omega who gets rejected like that is bad luck. Others just feel sorry for him. Either way, nobody wants to sit near him. Lyra felt something shift in her chest. A strange kind of recognition. She knew what it felt like to walk into a room and watch people decide, before you had said a single word, exactly what kind of person you must be. She knew what it felt like to be discussed in hushed voices by people who assumed you could not hear them. "Thank you," she told the serving girl, and turned back toward the man at the far table. He had not moved. He sat with the same still patience, occasionally glancing toward the doors as though gauging whether it might be acceptable to leave early. Lyra had spent enough gatherings doing exactly the same thing to recognize the calculation in his eyes. Her father called her name from across the room, gesturing for her to join a conversation with the Alpha of the Eastern Territories, a broad-shouldered man named Alden Marsh who had brought his unmarried son along, presumably hoping for a match that both families knew would never happen. Lyra excused herself as gracefully as she could and drifted toward her father's side, offering the required polite nods while Alden's son studiously avoided looking at the left side of her face. "My daughter is a fine hunter," her father was saying, the way he always tried to redirect attention toward her strengths rather than her scars. "Trained with the Keep's best trackers since she was 10. "Impressive," Alden said, in the tone of a man agreeing to something he had not actually heard. His son said nothing at all. Lyra excused herself again after only a few minutes, claiming she needed air, and stepped out onto the stone terrace that overlooked the training grounds below. The night was cold enough that her breath fogged slightly in front of her, and she was grateful for it, grateful for anything that gave her an excuse to stand apart from the noise inside. She thought about the man at the far table, Kian Voss, rejected by his fated mate in front of his entire pack. She tried to imagine the particular humiliation of that moment. Not simply losing someone you were bonded to by fate, but losing them publicly, with every eye in the room watching your face as it happened. She thought of her own scars, visible every single day, permanent evidence of a moment she had never asked for. At least her wound had faded to something people could pretend not to notice if they tried hard enough. His would follow him into every room for the rest of his life, the moment anyone learned his name. When she returned to the hall 20 minutes later, feast preparations were underway. Long benches filling with wolves eager for the meal. She scanned the crowd out of habit, expecting to see her usual spot at the edge of the room reserved and empty, the way it always was. Instead, she found herself hesitating in the doorway, unsure where exactly she was meant to sit, since her father had already taken his place at the head table beside the visiting alphas, deep in discussion about border patrols and trade routes. She found an open space near the middle of one long table, wedged between a pair of beta wolves from the Southern Territories who were mid-conversation about a hunting dispute neither of them seemed willing to let go of. She sat, hoping to disappear into the background noise, but within a few minutes the couple beside her rose to refill their cups and simply did not return, choosing instead to find seats elsewhere in the hall. She told herself it was a coincidence. She had told herself that particular lie so many times it barely registered as a lie anymore. Across the room, she saw a young Omega woman lean over to whisper something to her neighbor, both of them glancing toward Lyra before quickly looking away. She recognized the gesture immediately. It was the same gesture she had watched 1,000 times since the attack that left her marked, the same quiet exclusion dressed up as simple conversation. She sat with an empty space on either side of her at a table meant to seat 20 people, in a hall filled with hundreds of wolves who had traveled great distances for exactly this kind of gathering. And she felt, not for the first time, entirely and completely alone. She reached for her cup, keeping her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her look around the room in search of a place she clearly did not have. The noise of the feast rose around her, laughter, clinking cups, the low, steady rhythm of dozens of conversations happening at once, and none of it touched her at all. She might as well have been sitting in an empty hall. She did not notice at first the figure rising from the far end of the room. She did not notice the plain gray sleeve moving through the crowd, or the quiet murmurs that followed him as he crossed the hall, weaving between tables with the careful, deliberate steps of someone accustomed to being watched and judged wherever he went. She only noticed when a shadow fell across the empty space beside her, and a low, steady voice spoke words she had not expected to hear from anyone in that entire hall. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up, and found herself staring directly into the dark, careful eyes of Kian Voss, the rejected Omega from Rivermore, standing beside her with no apparent awareness. or perhaps complete awareness, that every single wolf in the hall had just gone quiet enough to hear him ask. Lyra did not answer right away. The question hung in the air between them while the surrounding tables slowly resumed their conversations, though several heads remained turned, watching to see what she would say. She was aware, suddenly, of every eye that had drifted toward her in the past hour, all of them waiting to see whether the king's scarred daughter would sit in the empty spaces they had left for her, or whether someone might finally choose to sit beside her on purpose. "No," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's not taken." Kian lowered himself onto the bench with the same unhurried calm he had carried across the hall, as though he had not just placed himself squarely in the center of 100 whispered conversations. He reached for the pitcher of water in front of them and filled his cup, then hers, without asking, the way a person might do for an old friend rather than a stranger they had never met. "Thank you," she said, more out of habit than genuine warmth, still waiting for whatever awkward silence usually followed a kind gesture toward her. People were often kind to her in careful, measured doses, as though generosity toward the scarred princess required a certain amount of bravery they wanted credit for. But Kian only nodded once and reached for the breadbasket, tearing off a piece for himself before offering the rest to her. There was no hesitation in the gesture, no lingering glance at the left side of her face, no performance of politeness meant to be witnessed by others. He simply behaved as though she were an ordinary person sharing an ordinary meal, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the strangeness of it. "You're from Rivermore," she said, mostly to fill the silence, though she already knew the answer. "I am." He glanced at her, a flicker of something crossing his expression, surprise, perhaps, that she knew anything about him at all. News travels fast in a hall this large. It usually does. She hesitated, unsure how much to acknowledge. "I heard there was trouble at home." His jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of tension she had seen in him since he sat down. "Trouble is one word for it," he said, his tone even, careful. "I imagine you already know the details, since half the hall seems to. I only know what a serving girl told me. I didn't ask her to share it, if that matters." "It does, actually." He looked at her directly then, and she found herself unable to look away from the quiet steadiness in his eyes. "Most people ask. They want to hear it from me, so they can watch my face while I say it." Lyra understood that particular cruelty better than she wanted to admit. She had lived through years of people asking about the attack that scarred her, watching her expression as she answered, searching for some flicker of pain they could carry away and discuss later. She had learned to give short, flat answers designed to end the conversation as quickly as possible, though it rarely worked. "I'm not going to ask," she said. "You don't owe me your story just because you sat down." Something shifted in his face then, a small, genuine softening that had nothing to do with performance. "That's the first time anyone said that to me in 3 months, he admitted. And for a moment, the practiced calm in his voice slipped just enough to reveal how tired he actually was beneath it. They ate in a silence that felt different from the one she was used to, not the heavy, awkward silence of people trying to figure out how to excuse themselves from her company, but something closer to comfortable. Around them, the feast continued, servers moving between tables with platters of roasted meat and autumn vegetables, musicians tuning their instruments near the far wall in preparation for the dancing that always followed the meal. "Why did you sit here?" she finally asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. "There were other seats, better ones probably, closer to your delegation." Kian considered the question for a moment before answering, turning his cup slowly between his fingers. "I watched you walk in earlier," he said. "I watched the whole room look at you and then look away, like you were something they'd rather not see. I recognized it because I've been getting the same look for months now. I figured if we were both going to sit alone in a room full of people, we might as well sit alone together." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She had expected some vague explanation, something about the bread or the wine, or simple proximity, not this direct acknowledgement of exactly what she had been feeling all evening. She did not know whether to be grateful or embarrassed that a stranger had seen through her so easily. "That's a strange kind of logic," she said, though there was no real edge in her voice. "Maybe. But it worked, didn't it? You're not sitting alone anymore." He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Neither am I." Across the hall she noticed her father watching them, his expression unreadable from this distance, though she could guess at the questions forming behind his eyes. She looked away before their gazes could meet directly, unwilling to let the small, fragile ease of this conversation be interrupted by whatever concerns he was already forming. The musicians began to play, a slow, formal piece meant to open the evening's dancing, and several couples rose from their seats to move toward the cleared space at the center of the hall. Lyra watched them for a moment, the familiar ache returning at the sight of pairs moving easily together, none of them sparing a glance toward the table where she sat. "You don't dance," Kian said, not quite a question, watching her expression rather than the dancers. "I used to." She kept her eyes on the moving couples. "It's been a while since anyone's asked." "I wouldn't be much good at it myself," he admitted. "Rivermore doesn't teach the formal steps the way the capital does. I'd probably step on your feet within the first minute." She almost laughed, surprising herself with how close the sound came to escaping. "That's not exactly a strong argument for asking me anyway." "I wasn't asking. I was explaining why I'm staying right here, eating bread, where I can't embarrass either of us." He said it with enough dry humor that she found herself smiling despite the strange, hollow evening she had been having only an hour before. They talked for a long while after that, about smaller things, the differences between Rivermore's forested territory and the open plains surrounding Ashford Keep, the kind of game each region hunted, the particular quality of the wine being served that evening, which Kian declared far too sweet for his taste. None of it touched the two subjects that clearly sat heaviest in the room around them, her scars or his rejection, and she found herself grateful for the reprieve. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she was simply having a conversation, rather than surviving one. Eventually her father approached their table, his expression carefully neutral in the way she recognized, from years of watching him manage difficult diplomatic moments. "Lyra," he said, his gaze moving briefly to Kian before returning to her. "I wanted to introduce you to a few more of our guests before the evening ends." She understood the underlying message clearly enough, an invitation to step away, phrased gently enough to avoid outright rudeness in front of a stranger. She hesitated, unwilling to leave the first genuinely easy conversation she'd had in months, but aware that refusing her father in front of the hall would draw exactly the kind of attention she had spent the evening trying to avoid. "Of course," she said, rising from the bench. She glanced back at Kian before following her father across the hall. "Thank you for the seat." "Any time," he said, and something in the simple, unremarkable word felt larger than it should have, a small promise neither of them had quite intended to make. The rest of the evening passed in the usual blur of polite introductions and careful conversations that never quite reached anywhere meaningful. Alphas asked her father about trade agreements, betas discussed border patrols, a handful of unmarried sons were paraded past her with the same transparent hope that had followed her through every gathering since she turned 18, though none of them lingered long enough to have an actual conversation. She found her gaze drifting back toward the far table more than once, where Kian sat alone again, watching the room with the same careful stillness she had first noticed hours earlier. She wondered whether their conversation had meant as much to him as it had to her, or whether she had simply imagined a connection that existed only because she was desperate for any kind of kindness that evening. By the time the gathering began winding down, torches burning low along the corridor walls and guests filtering slowly toward their assigned quarters for the night, Lyra found herself searching the departing crowd for one particular figure. She spotted him near the entrance, exchanging a brief word with one of the Rivermore delegates before turning to leave. Their eyes met across the emptying hall, and he offered her a small, deliberate nod, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that needed no audience and no explanation. She returned it, feeling something warm settle in her chest for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, even as the rational part of her mind reminded her that gatherings ended, delegations returned home, and kindness offered in a single evening rarely survived the morning after. She walked back to her carriage beside her father, the cold night air sharp against her face, and found herself hoping, quietly and against her better judgment, that Rivermore's delegation might have reason to stay a little longer than usual. Morning at Ashford Keep arrived with the usual sounds Lyra had known her entire life, the distant clang of the training yard, servants moving through the halls with baskets of linen, the low murmur of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast for the departing delegations. She lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of her chamber, replaying the previous evening in fragments that felt almost unreal in the daylight. She told herself it had been a small thing, a single conversation, born out of two people finding themselves equally unwanted in a crowded room. It did not need to mean anything beyond that. Delegations from Rivermore would leave within the week, and whatever fragile ease she had found across that table would fade the way most things faded once distance settled between them. And yet, when she dressed and made her way down to the main hall for breakfast, she found herself scanning the tables for a particular gray sleeve before she had even fully admitted to herself that she was looking. She did not see him. The Rivermore delegation's usual table sat mostly empty, only two of its members present, deep in conversation about the journey home. Disappointment settled in her chest. quieter and heavier than she expected, and she chided herself for caring so much about a man she had known for less than a single evening. "You're distracted this morning," her father observed, watching her over the rim of his cup as she picked at a piece of bread without eating much of it. "I'm tired," she said, which was not entirely a lie. He studied her a moment longer, the particular look he reserved for matters he intended to raise eventually, but had decided not to press just yet. "The Rivermore delegation is staying an extra 2 days," he said instead, returning his attention to the papers beside his plate. "Apparently there are trade discussions that need finishing before they return north." Lyra kept her expression carefully neutral, though something in her chest lifted at the news before she could stop it. "That's good for the Treasury, I imagine." "It is." Her father glanced at her again, something knowing in his eyes that made her wonder exactly how much he had already guessed. "I noticed you spoke with one of their Omegas last night." "I did," she said simply, refusing to offer more than the facts required. "He offered me a seat when no one else did. I was grateful for the company." Her father said nothing further on the subject, though the careful way he folded his papers suggested he was filing the information away for later consideration. Lyra finished what little breakfast she could manage and excused herself, choosing the training yard over another hour trapped inside the keep with her own restless thoughts. The training yard sat at the eastern edge of the castle grounds, a wide stretch of packed earth surrounded by wooden fences, used daily by warriors and hunters practicing their forms. Lyra had trained there since childhood, one of the few places within the keep where she felt fully herself, rather than a scarred curiosity on display. She retrieved her bow from the equipment shed and began working through her usual drills, grateful for the simple, repetitive focus required to nock an arrow and release it cleanly toward the target. She had been at it for perhaps 20 minutes when she noticed movement near the yard's entrance, a familiar gray sleeve catching her attention before she consciously registered who it belonged to. Kian stood near the fence, watching her with the same quiet stillness she remembered from the feast hall, though something in his posture today seemed slightly more relaxed, less braced against the world. "You're an excellent shot," he called out, once she had lowered her bow. "You've been watching long enough to judge that?" "Long enough." He walked closer, stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to talk without shouting across the yard. "I was told the training grounds were open to visitors this morning. I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not." She retrieved her arrows from the target, grateful for something to occupy her hands while her thoughts settled. "I heard your delegation is staying a few extra days." "Trade discussions," he said, though something in his tone suggested he found the excuse amusing. "Or so I'm told. I suspect our lead negotiator simply enjoys your father's wine cellar more than he lets on." She laughed before she could stop herself, the sound surprising her with how easily it came. That wouldn't be the first time a treaty was extended for less noble reasons. They fell into an easy rhythm after that, Lyra continuing her drills while Kian watched, occasionally offering commentary that revealed a surprising knowledge of archery for someone who claimed to have no formal training in it. When she asked how an Omega from Rivermore had learned so much about bow work, he explained that his pack lived along a heavily forested border, where hunting skills mattered more than rank, and every wolf, regardless of designation, learned to defend themselves. "We don't have the luxury of separating duties the way larger territories do," he said, watching her nock another arrow. "Alphas hunt beside Omegas, beside Betas. Rivermore is small enough that everyone has to be useful in more than one way." "That sounds better than what we have here, honestly," Lyra admitted, releasing the arrow toward the target with a satisfying thud. "Everything in Ashford is divided by rank. Alphas train for combat, Omegas train for diplomacy and healing, Betas fill in wherever needed. It's efficient, I suppose, but it doesn't leave much room for anyone to be more than what they were born to be." Kian was quiet for a moment, watching her retrieve another arrow. "Is that why you train here, to be more than what people expect from you?" The question landed with more weight than she expected, and she found herself considering it seriously, rather than offering a quick deflection. "Maybe," she admitted. "After the attack, everyone treated me like something fragile that needed protecting, my father included, though he'd never admit it outright. Training here is the one place I get to prove I'm not broken, even if half the keep still looks at me like I am." "You're not broken," he said simply, without the careful hesitation most people used when discussing her scars, without the performance of sympathy she had grown so tired of over the years. "Anyone who thinks that hasn't actually looked at you." She turned to face him fully, arrow forgotten in her hand, struck by the plain sincerity in his voice. "You barely know me," she said, though the words came out softer than she intended. "I know enough," he said. "I know you sat through an entire feast being ignored by people who owe your family their loyalty, and you didn't complain once. I know you train with a bow well enough to put most alphas to shame. I know you noticed me sitting alone before I noticed you, which tells me you pay more attention to people than most royals bother to." Lyra did not know how to respond to that, so she simply returned to her drills, though her hands trembled slightly around the bow, and it took her 3 attempts to land an arrow anywhere near the center of the target. Kian did not comment on the miss, only watched quietly, giving her the space to recover without the added pressure of an audience openly judging her performance. They spent the better part of the morning together, moving eventually from the archery range to a quieter path that wound along the eastern wall of the keep, overlooking the forest that stretched toward the horizon. Kian asked careful questions about her childhood, about her mother, about the years before the attack that had reshaped so much of her life, and Lyra found herself answering more openly than she had with anyone in a very long time. In turn, she asked about Rivermore, about his family, about the years before whatever had happened with his fated mate, though she was careful not to press toward that particular subject directly. "You never asked about her," Kian observed at one point, as they paused along the wall, looking out over the tree line. "Everyone else asks eventually." "I told you last night I wasn't going to," Lyra said. "I meant it." He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought perhaps she had misjudged the moment, pressed somewhere she should not have. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the guarded tension she expected. "Her name was Petra," he said. "We were bonded from birth, fated in the way most pacts consider unbreakable. I spent years assuming we would simply grow into each other eventually, the way fate intended." He paused, jaw tightening slightly. When the bond finally activated, she rejected it in front of the entire pack, said she couldn't imagine spending her life with someone she'd never chosen for herself. I understood the reasoning, eventually. I even respected it, once the humiliation faded enough to think clearly. But respecting it and living with it turned out to be very different things. "I'm sorry," Lyra said, and meant it fully, without the hollow performance of sympathy she usually offered or received. "Don't be." He glanced at her, something steadier settling in his expression. "It taught me something useful in the end. I stopped waiting for fate to decide who mattered to me. I'd rather choose someone, and be chosen back, than spend my life bonded to someone who never wanted the choice in the first place." The words settled between them with a weight that neither acknowledged directly, though Lyra felt them land somewhere deep in her chest, a quiet recognition of exactly how much they had both learned to survive without the things they were supposed to have been guaranteed. They walked back toward the keep as the midday sun climbed higher, their conversation drifting toward lighter subjects again, though something had shifted between them, something neither of them named but both seemed to feel. As they approached the main courtyard, Lyra noticed her father standing near the entrance, watching their approach with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and concern. "Your father doesn't approve," Kian observed quietly, following her gaze. "He hasn't said that," Lyra said, though she suspected it was only a matter of time before he did. "He doesn't need to say it. I've seen that look before, on my own father, more times than I can count." Kian's voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of resigned understanding. "Kings worry about legacies. Omegas without standing rarely fit neatly into those plans." "Maybe not," Lyra said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "But I've spent 4 years being told what I'm not allowed to want, because of how I look, because of what happened to me. I'm not particularly interested in being told the same thing about who I'm allowed to talk to." Kian studied her for a long moment, something warm and quietly hopeful passing behind his eyes, before he offered a small, genuine smile. "Then I suppose we'll both find out exactly how much trouble that causes," he said, and together they walked the rest of the way into the courtyard, neither of them quite ready yet to face whatever conversation waited for them inside. King Draven waited until the evening meal had ended, and the last of the serving staff had cleared the table, before he raised the subject he had clearly been holding all day. Lyra recognized the particular stillness that settled over him whenever he prepared to discuss something difficult, the way his shoulders squared slightly, the way his voice dropped into the careful, measured tone he used during council meetings rather than family conversations. "You spent most of the day with the Rivermore Omega," he said, not quite a question. "His name is Kian," Lyra said, keeping her own voice level. "And yes, I did." Her father set down his cup, folding his hands in front of him. "I'm not asking to scold you, Lyra. I only want to understand what's happening, because you've barely spoken 2 words to anyone outside this keep in the past 2 years, and now you've spent an entire morning walking the eastern wall with a man you met yesterday." "He's easy to talk to," she said simply. "That's all." "Is that so difficult to believe?" "It's not difficult to believe at all," her father said, and something in his tone softened slightly. "It's difficult to plan for. You are my only heir, Lyra." Whoever you eventually choose to stand beside will shape the future of this entire territory, whether either of us likes that responsibility or not. An Omega with no pack standing, freshly rejected by his own fated mate, arriving here with a trade delegation that leaves within the week, is not exactly the foundation most advisors would recommend building a future on. I'm not building a future, Lyra said, though the words felt smaller than she intended, less certain than she wanted them to sound. I'm having conversations with someone who doesn't treat me like something broken. That's not a political alliance, Father. It's just relief. Her father studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his next words carefully, the way he weighed every decision that might ripple outward into consequences he could not fully predict. I worry about you, he finally said. I worry that after everything you've survived, you might mistake simple kindness for something larger, simply because you've been starved of it for so long. The observation stung more than she wanted to admit, precisely because some quiet, honest part of her recognized the truth buried inside it. She had spent 4 years watching people flinch away from her, watching suitors disappear, watching friends drift into distant politeness. It would be easy, she knew, to mistake the first genuine warmth she had encountered in years for something deeper than it actually was. But it would also be easy, she thought, for her father's worry to become another wall keeping her from the one thing that had actually made her feel like herself again, in longer than she could remember. I hear your concern, she said carefully, but I'm not a child anymore, and I'm not going to stop talking to someone simply because his family lacks the standing you'd prefer. If it becomes something more than conversation, we can discuss it properly then. Until that happens, I'd ask you to trust me enough to make my own choices about who I spend my time with. Her father was quiet for a long while, studying the grain of the wooden table between them. Very well, he said eventually, though the reluctance in his voice remained clear. But I ask you to be careful, Lyra. Rejected mates carry wounds that don't always heal cleanly. I would hate to see you become collateral damage in whatever grief he's still working through. She did not have a ready answer for that particular concern, mostly because some quiet part of her had already wondered the same thing during the long walk back from the eastern wall. She excused herself from the table shortly after, retreating to her chamber with her thoughts tangled between her father's warnings and the steady warmth she had felt standing beside Kian earlier that day. The following morning, she found Kian in the keep's modest library, seated near one of the tall windows, a book open on the table in front of him, though his attention seemed to drift more toward the courtyard below than the pages themselves. He looked up as she entered, offering a small smile that did nothing to calm the uncertain flutter in her chest. Your father spoke with you, he said, before she had even taken a seat across from him. I could tell by the careful way that guard outside watched me walk in here this morning. He worries, Lyra admitted, settling into the chair across from him. It's not unreasonable, given everything. You're a stranger, your delegation leaves soon, and I'm the only heir to an entire territory. Kings don't get to ignore those kinds of details. No, Kian agreed. I imagine they don't. He closed the book in front of him, giving her his full attention. For what it's worth, I don't expect anything from you, Lyra. I didn't sit beside you at that feast because I saw an opportunity. I sat there because I recognized what it felt like to be alone in a room that should have made room for me, and I didn't want either of us to sit through that particular kind of evening without at least one person willing to notice. I know, she said, and found that she meant it fully, but my father raised something else, something I haven't stopped thinking about since last night. Kian waited, his expression open, patient. He mentioned your rejection, she said carefully. Not unkindly, but he worried I might be mistaking your kindness toward me for something it isn't, given how recently you experienced something so painful yourself. He worried I might become collateral while you work through whatever grief is still sitting underneath everything. She watched something flicker across Kian's face, not offense but a kind of quiet, thoughtful consideration, as though he had turned the question over honestly rather than dismissing it outright. That's a fair thing to worry about, he admitted after a moment. I won't pretend the rejection didn't hurt. It did. More than I expected, even though I understood Petra's reasoning long before she said the words aloud. But I don't think what I feel when I talk to you has anything to do with trying to fill whatever space she left behind. How do you know that? Lyra asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Because when I think about Petra, I mostly feel relief now, underneath whatever bruise is still healing, Kian said. Relief that neither of us has to spend our lives pretending a bond chosen for us was ever going to be enough. When I think about you, I don't feel relief. I feel curious. I want to know what you think about things, what makes you laugh, what you're like when you're not busy defending yourself from a room full of strangers. That's a very different feeling, Lyra, and I think you know that as well as I do. She sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the careful walls she had built around herself over the past 4 years shift slightly, not collapsing entirely, but softening enough to let something new settle inside them. My father also mentioned something else, she said finally, about what happened to you being seen as bad luck by some people. Whispers that an Omega freshly rejected carries some kind of curse with him. Kian's jaw tightened slightly, the first real flash of old pain crossing his features since she had known him. I've heard those whispers, he admitted. Some of my own pack believe it, or claim to. It's easier, I think, for people to imagine bad luck follows a rejected Omega than to admit that sometimes fate simply gets things wrong, and two people are better off apart than bound together against their will. I don't believe in curses, Lyra said quietly. I believe people look for reasons to explain things they don't understand, and rejection is easier to explain away as misfortune than as two people simply not being right for each other. You sound very certain of that. I've had 4 years of people whispering explanations for my scars that had nothing to do with what actually happened, she said. Some people said I was cursed too, back when the attack first happened. Marked by something dark, they said, as though claw marks carried some deeper meaning beyond the obvious fact that a rival pack attacked our border, and I happened to be standing in the wrong place. People need stories, Kian, even when the truth is simpler and sadder than any story they could invent. Something eased in his expression at that, a recognition passing between them that needed no further explanation. They spent the rest of the morning in the library, moving between quiet conversation and comfortable silence, occasionally interrupted by the soft rustle of pages as Kian returned to his book, or Lyra pulled a volume of her own from the nearby shelves. It was during one of these quiet stretches that a servant arrived with a message for Kian, informing him that the Rivermore delegation's lead negotiator wished to speak with him regarding the treaty discussions scheduled for that afternoon. Kian rose reluctantly, gathering his book, though he paused before leaving, turning back toward Lyra with a small, genuine smile. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad your father's worry didn't stop you from coming to find me this morning. For what it's worth, she replied, so am I. He left the library with a lightness in his step that had not been there when she first found him seated by the window, and Lyra remained behind for a long while afterward, turning their conversation over in her mind, feeling something quietly hopeful take root in the careful, guarded space she had spent 4 years building around her heart. 3 days passed, and then 5, and the Rivermore delegation's departure kept slipping further into the future, delayed first by unfinished trade discussions, then by an unexpected shipment of grain that needed proper accounting, then by a stretch of heavy rain that made the northern roads impassable. Lyra suspected, without any real proof, that the delegation's lead negotiator had simply grown fond enough of King Draven's wine cellar and hospitality to invent reasons to extend the visit, though she was careful never to voice the suspicion aloud. Whatever the reason, the extra days gave her something she had not expected to find again so easily, a steady, growing friendship that filled the empty hours of her days with a warmth she had almost forgotten how to recognize. She and Kian fell into an easy rhythm together, meeting most mornings in the training yard, where she continued her archery drills while he offered commentary that had grown sharper and more knowledgeable the longer he watched her work. He admitted, eventually, that he had begun practicing on his own in the early hours before she arrived, determined not to remain entirely useless with a bow in his hands. You're improving, she told him one morning, watching him release an arrow that landed, if not perfectly centered, at least respectably close to the target's middle ring. High praise, he said dryly, retrieving another arrow from the quiver at his hip. I assume that means my first attempts were somewhere closer to disastrous. I didn't say that. She fought back a smile. I only said you're improving, which implies a starting point worth improving from. He knocked the arrow, drawing the string back with a form that had grown noticeably steadier over the past several days. I'll take the compliment regardless. Their conversations had grown easier too, drifting naturally between lighter subjects and deeper ones without the careful hesitation that had marked their first few exchanges. Kian told her more about Rivermore, about the small forest pack he had grown up in, about the particular way its wolves valued usefulness over rank, a value system so different from Ashford's rigid hierarchy that Lyra found herself genuinely curious about what it might be like to live somewhere that judged its people by what they contributed, rather than what they were born as. In turn, she told him more about her mother, about the years before the attack, about the particular ache of watching her father grow more careful and guarded with each passing year, as though he feared losing her the way he had lost his wife. She told him eventually about the attack itself, the details she rarely shared with anyone, the sharp confusion of the moment, the strange calm that had settled over her right before the pain arrived, the long months of recovery that followed, filled with careful, pitying glances from people who no longer knew how to look at her the same way. Kian listened without interrupting, without flinching, without offering the hollow reassurances she had grown so tired of hearing over the years. When she finished, he simply reached over and took her hand, a small, steady gesture that carried more comfort than any words could have offered. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "I know that's not an easy thing to hand someone." "It's easier than I expected," she admitted. "You don't flinch when I talk about it. Most people do, even when they're trying hard not to." "I've had enough of my own painful things to talk about," he said. "I know what it feels like when someone flinches at the wrong moment. I try not to be that person for anyone else, if I can help it." They spent that particular afternoon walking further than usual, following a narrow path that wound down toward the river that bordered Ashford's southern edge, the water running high and fast after days of rain. Kian skipped stones across the surface with a casual skill that suggested years of childhood practice, and Lyra found herself laughing more freely than she had in longer than she could remember, the sound surprising her each time it escaped. "You have a good laugh," Kian observed at one point, watching her rather than the water. "You should let it out more often." "I haven't had much reason to, these past few years," she admitted. "It's strange how quickly that changes when someone actually gives you a reason." "I'd like to keep giving you reasons, if you'll let me," he said, and something in the simple honesty of the statement settled warmly in her chest, quieting the last of her father's careful warnings, at least for the moment. Their friendship did not go unnoticed within the keep, of course. Servants whispered about the pair walking the grounds together each morning, and several of the visiting alphas exchanged pointed glances whenever Kian and Lyra appeared together at meals, no longer content to sit at opposite ends of the hall. Lyra found she cared less about the whispers than she once might have, though she noticed her father's careful attention growing sharper with each passing day, his gaze following them whenever they crossed his line of sight. One evening, nearly a week after the gathering had officially ended, Lyra found Kian in the keep's modest garden, seated on a low stone bench beneath one of the ancient oak trees that had stood on the grounds since before her grandfather's time. He looked up as she approached, offering the easy smile that had become as familiar to her now as her own reflection. "I received word today," he said before she had fully settled beside him. "The delegation leaves in 3 days. The roads have cleared enough for travel, and there's no reasonable excuse left to delay any further." The news landed heavier than she expected, a sudden ache settling in her chest at the thought of the easy mornings and warm afternoons coming to an end so soon. 3 days, she repeated, mostly to give herself a moment to steady her voice. "I know," Kian said quietly. "I've been trying to figure out what to say about it for most of the afternoon, and I still haven't found the right words." "Maybe there aren't any right words," Lyra said. "Maybe it's just going to hurt, however we say it." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the last light of the evening fade behind the keep's stone walls, neither of them quite ready to address the question hanging heavily between them, the question of what, exactly, this careful growing friendship was supposed to become once distance separated them again. "I don't want to go back to pretending this past week didn't happen," Kian finally said, breaking the silence. "I don't want to return to Rivermore and simply resume the life I had before, as though I never sat beside you at that feast, as though I never learned what it felt like to talk with someone who understood exactly what it means to be looked at and dismissed in the same breath." "Then don't," Lyra said, surprising herself with how simply the words came. "Write to me. Visit when you can. I don't know what this is yet, Kian, but I know I don't want it to end, just because a delegation's business is finished." He studied her for a long moment, something warm and quietly hopeful passing behind his eyes. "Your father won't be pleased," he said, though there was no real worry in his voice, only a kind of resigned acknowledgement. "My father worries about a great many things," Lyra said. "I've spent 4 years letting his worry shape most of my decisions. I think it's time I decided a few things for myself." Kian reached over and took her hand again, the same steady gesture that had comforted her days earlier, though something in the moment felt different now, charged with a quiet significance neither of them fully named. "Then I'll write," he said, "and I'll visit, whenever Rivermore's business brings me anywhere near Ashford's borders. And if that's not often enough, I'll invent reasons, the way our lead negotiator has clearly been doing with your father's wine cellar." She laughed, the sound easing some of the ache that had settled in her chest since he first mentioned the delegation's departure, and for a while longer they simply sat together beneath the old oak tree, watching the stars emerge one by one over the keep's stone walls, neither of them willing to rush the last quiet evenings they had left before the world outside their small, careful friendship came pressing back in. King Draven summoned Lyra to his private study the following morning, a request that came delivered by one of the household guards rather than spoken directly, a formality her father rarely bothered with unless the matter at hand felt particularly weighty. She climbed the stairs to his study with a familiar tightness settling in her chest, already guessing at the subject that awaited her. Her father stood near the tall window overlooking the courtyard when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he adopted whenever he needed to appear composed while working through something difficult. He did not turn immediately, letting the silence stretch long enough that Lyra found herself speaking first, if only to break the tension. "You wanted to see me." "I did." He turned then, his expression carrying the particular weariness she associated with council meetings that ran too long. "The Rivermore delegation leaves in 3 days." "I know," she said simply. "Kian told me last night." Something flickered across her father's face at the easy familiarity in her voice, though he did not comment on it directly. "I've spent the past week watching the two of you grow closer, Lyra, and I've said very little about it, because I wanted to trust your judgment the way you asked me to. But I would be failing you as your father, and as your king, if I didn't raise a few concerns before this delegation departs and takes whatever understanding you've reached with them." "Then raise them," Lyra said, keeping her voice steady, though a familiar defensiveness rose in her chest. Her father moved to his desk, gesturing for her to sit in the chair across from him, though she remained standing, needing the small assertion of choosing her own posture in a conversation she suspected would ask her to yield on far larger matters. He seemed to notice, and did not press the point. "Rivermore is a small territory," he began, folding his hands in front of him. "Respected, certainly, and loyal to our alliance, but small, and without the resources or standing that would make a match with their people particularly advantageous for Ashford's future. If you were to grow attached to this young man, and if that attachment were to become something more formal, you would be choosing to align our territory's future with a pact that offers very little beyond genuine friendship." "Is friendship not worth something?" Lyra asked. "You've spent years arranging introductions with sons from wealthy, powerful territories, and not one of them has ever looked at me the way Kian does. Not one of them has ever sat with me through an entire feast, or listened to me talk about the attack without flinching, or made me laugh the way I haven't laughed in years. If friendship and genuine affection aren't worth anything in your calculations, father, then I don't know what you think I'm actually supposed to be looking for." Her father was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had softened slightly, though the underlying worry remained clear. "I think you're looking for exactly what every person deserves to find, Lyra. I only worry that you've found it in circumstances that will make your life more difficult than it needs to be. An Omega with no significant standing, recently rejected by his own fated mate, arriving from a small territory with little to offer politically, is not a match that will be received easily by our council, or by the neighboring territories who watch every decision you make as an indication of Ashford's future direction. So I'm meant to choose my future based on what pleases the council," Lyra said, "rather than what actually makes me happy. You're meant to understand that as heir to this territory, your choices ripple outward in ways that go beyond your own happiness," her father said, his tone firmer now, though not unkind. "I am not telling you to end whatever friendship you've built with him. I am asking you to be clear-eyed about what it would mean to pursue something more, given everything Ashford would require of whoever eventually stands beside you." Lyra felt the familiar weight of duty settle over her shoulders, the same weight that had shaped nearly every decision of her life since her mother's death, since the attack that left her scarred, since the moment she understood exactly what it meant to be the only heir to a powerful territory. She had spent years accepting that weight without question, allowing it to dictate who she spoke with, how she carried herself, what she was allowed to want. "I understand what you're asking," she said finally, "but I've spent 4 years being told, in careful, indirect ways, that I'm not worth choosing, that my scars make me less desirable, less suitable, less worthy of the kind of easy affection other people take for granted. For the first time since the attack, I've found someone who looks at me and sees exactly what's there, without flinching, without pity, without calculating what my scars might cost him politically. I'm not ready to give that up simply because his territory happens to be small." Her father studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, worry and pride and old grief tangled together in a way she recognized from years of watching him navigate difficult decisions. "I'm not asking you to give it up," he said finally. "I'm asking you to be careful, and to remember that whatever you choose, the responsibility of this territory doesn't disappear simply because your heart has found something it wants." "I remember that every single day," Lyra said quietly. "I've never once forgotten what I owe Ashford, but I think I'm allowed to want something for myself too, father, even while I carry that responsibility." The conversation ended without full resolution, her father's concerns neither fully addressed nor fully dismissed, though something had shifted between them, a grudging acknowledgement on his part that she had grown into someone capable of weighing these decisions for herself, whether or not he agreed with the choices she ultimately made. She left the study feeling the familiar mixture of relief and unease that followed most of her conversations with her father, grateful that he had not forbidden her outright from pursuing whatever this was with Kian, but aware that his concerns carried a weight she could not simply dismiss. Ashford's counsel would have opinions of their own, opinions likely far less generous than her father's careful, worried affection. She found Kian later that afternoon in the training yard, working through archery drills with the same steady focus he had developed over the past week. He looked up as she approached, reading something in her expression that made him lower his bow immediately. "Your father spoke with you," he said. "He did." She sat on the low wooden fence at the yard's edge, watching him approach. "He worries about the same things you already guessed he would. Rivermore's standing, your recent rejection, what it would mean politically for Ashford's future if I chose to pursue something more with someone who offers little beyond genuine affection." Kian sat beside her, his expression carefully composed, though she could see the old, familiar wound flickering somewhere beneath the surface. "He's not wrong to worry about those things," he said. "I've thought about them myself, more than once, especially these past few days. I have very little to offer you, Lyra, beyond the fact that I see you clearly, and that seeing you clearly has become the best part of my day, every single day since that feast." "That's not little," Lyra said firmly. "That's everything I've been missing for 4 years. "Maybe," Kian said. "But your father isn't entirely wrong that it might not be enough, not when weighed against everything Ashford's counsel will expect from whoever eventually stands beside its heir." Lyra reached over and took his hand, the same steady gesture he had offered her days earlier beneath the old oak tree. "I don't know what the future holds," she said. "I don't know if this becomes something larger, or if distance eventually pulls us apart despite our best intentions. But I know that whatever happens, I'm not going to let my father's worry, or the council's expectations, decide in advance that what we've found this week doesn't matter. We'll figure out the rest as it comes." Kian squeezed her hand gently, something steady and warm settling into his expression despite the uncertainty still hanging over both their futures. "Then I suppose that's all either of us can ask for," he said. "The chance to figure it out, one difficult conversation at a time." They sat together at the fence's edge as the afternoon light shifted golden across the training yard, neither of them fully certain what the coming weeks would bring, but both quietly determined not to let the weight of politics and standing erase what had grown between them in the space of a single, unlikely week. The messenger arrived at Ashford Keep 2 days before the Rivermore delegation's scheduled departure, his horse lathered with sweat from a hard ride, his face grim with news that sent the entire household into a quiet, controlled scramble of preparation. King Draven received him in the main hall, and Lyra watched from the gallery above as her father's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something far more guarded. She descended the stairs quickly, arriving just as the messenger finished delivering his report. "What's happened?" she asked, though something in her father's posture already told her the news was serious. "The Hollowmere Pack has requested an audience," her father said, his voice carefully controlled. "They wish to discuss a peace treaty, formalizing an end to the hostilities between our territories." Lyra felt her stomach drop at the name, a cold weight settling over her that had nothing to do with the pleasant warmth she had grown accustomed to over the past week. Hollowmere was the pack responsible for the border skirmish that left her scarred, the same pack that had haunted her nightmares in the months following the attack, the same pack her father had spent years maintaining careful, wary distance from. "They want peace," she repeated, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "After everything they did." "That's what the message claims," her father said, his jaw tight. "Apparently their new alpha, someone named Cassius Thorne, has taken leadership recently and wishes to distance his pack from the actions of his predecessor. He claims the attack that scarred you was carried out by rogue members acting without proper authority, and he wants to formalize a treaty that puts old hostilities to rest." "Do you believe that?" Lyra asked. Her father was quiet for a long moment, his expression carefully unreadable. "I don't know what to believe yet," he admitted. "Peace with Hollowmere would benefit both territories considerably, if it's genuine. But I've learned enough about that pack over the years to remain cautious about taking their claims at face value." The council convened that same evening to discuss the request, and Lyra found herself pacing the corridor outside the meeting chamber long after the discussion had concluded, unable to settle the unease that had taken root in her chest since the messenger's arrival. She found Kian waiting for her near the library entrance, having heard the news through the same quiet channels of gossip that moved through every corner of the keep. "You've heard," she said, joining him by the window. "I have." His expression carried a careful concern that mirrored her own unease. "How are you feeling about it?" "Uneasy," she admitted. "Hollowmere hasn't sought peace in the 11 years since the attack. Why now? Why so suddenly, and so soon after a gathering that brought half the Northern Territories together in one place?" Kian considered the question seriously, his brow furrowing in the way she had come to recognize whenever he turned something over carefully in his mind. "I don't know Hollowmere well," he said. "Rivermore sits far enough south that we've had little direct contact with them. But timing like that does seem worth questioning. Peace offers rarely arrive without some underlying motive, even when the surface reasoning sounds genuine." "My father shares that suspicion," Lyra said, "but the council seems inclined to at least hear them out. A formal peace would strengthen Ashford's borders considerably, and Hollowmere's territory sits along a valuable trade route we've been cut off from for over a decade." "When do they arrive?" "Within the week, apparently. My father sent word agreeing to a preliminary meeting, though he's insisted on careful precautions." Lyra rubbed her arms, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of the library. "I haven't set foot near anyone from Hollowmere since the day of the attack. I don't know how I'm supposed to sit across a table from them and pretend 11 years of scars and nightmares simply don't matter." Kian reached for her hand, the gesture as steady and grounding as it had always been. "You don't have to pretend anything," he said. "And you don't have to face them alone, if you don't want to. I know I'm meant to be leaving in 2 days, but I could ask my delegation for permission to extend my stay a little longer, if that would help." The offer landed with more warmth than she expected, given everything currently weighing on her mind. "You'd do that?" "Of course I would." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I told you I wanted to keep giving you reasons to laugh, Lyra. I meant that. I'm not about to abandon you the moment something difficult arrives at your doorstep, especially something tied to the worst day of your life." She felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes, an unfamiliar sensation after years of carefully guarding her emotions from public display. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "More than I can properly explain." Kian sent word to his delegation's lead negotiator that evening, requesting permission to remain at Ashford Keep a while longer, citing the value of maintaining Rivermore's presence during any negotiations with Hollowmere, given the potential impact on regional stability. The negotiator, perhaps genuinely invested in continued diplomatic goodwill, or perhaps simply enjoying the extended stay as much as Lyra suspected, granted the request without much argument. Over the following days, as preparations for Hollowmere's arrival intensified throughout the keep, Lyra found herself drawn increasingly toward the training yard, working through her archery drills with an intensity that went beyond simple practice. Something about the approaching visit had reawakened old instincts she thought she had buried years earlier, a wariness that refused to settle no matter how many times she told herself the meeting would remain civil and controlled. Kian noticed the shift in her almost immediately, joining her in the yard each morning, though he said little about it directly, seeming to understand that she needed the physical outlet more than she needed conversation. It was during one of these quiet morning sessions that he first raised a concern that had apparently been building in his own mind. "Something feels wrong about this," he said, watching her release an arrow toward the target with more force than the drill strictly required. "I've been asking around, quietly, among some of the other delegates still here from the gathering. A few of them mentioned that Hollowmere's new Alpha has been unusually active these past few months, expanding patrols along several border territories, not just Ashford's." "Expanding patrols doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister," Lyra said, though her own instincts had been whispering similar concerns since the messenger's arrival. "No," Kian agreed. "But combined with a sudden peace offer, directed specifically at the territory that suffered the worst under Hollowmere's previous leadership, it does seem worth watching carefully. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, Lyra, especially given everything this visit already means to you personally, but something about the timing continues to bother me. And I don't think either of us should ignore that feeling simply because it's inconvenient." Lyra lowered her bow, considering his words seriously. She had learned, over the past week, to trust Kian's instincts, the same quiet, careful attention to detail that had first drawn her to notice him across a crowded feast hall. If something about Hollowmere's sudden peace offer troubled him enough to voice concern, she suspected it was worth taking seriously, regardless of how the council or her father had already begun leaning toward cautious optimism. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. "I think we should watch carefully," Kian said. "Ask questions, quietly, without alarming anyone unnecessarily. And I think you should trust your own instincts too, Lyra, whatever they're telling you about sitting across a table from the pack that scarred you. If something feels wrong, it usually is." She nodded slowly, gratitude settling alongside her unease. "Thank you for staying," she said. "I don't think I could face whatever's coming without you here." You wouldn't have to face it alone regardless, Kian said, but I'm glad I get to be the one standing beside you while you do. 3 days later, Holomir's delegation arrived at Ashford Keep's gates, banners bearing the pack's dark crest snapping in the autumn wind, and Lyra stood beside her father at the entrance, her heart pounding with a mixture of old fear and careful, watchful resolve. Kian's steady presence just behind her shoulder, a quiet anchor against the storm of memory threatening to pull her back into the terror of that long-ago attack. Cassius Thorne cut an imposing figure as he dismounted before the Keep's gates, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back from a face that carried none of the cruelty Lyra had expected, based on years of imagining what Holomir's leadership must look like. He bowed formally to King Draven, his manner polished and careful, every word chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to diplomatic negotiation. "Thank you for receiving us," he said, his gaze moving briefly toward Lyra, before returning respectfully to her father. "I understand this visit carries difficult history for your family, and I want to assure you that I take that history seriously. We'll discuss the details inside," King Draven said, his tone civil but carefully guarded, offering none of the easy warmth he extended to trusted allies. The negotiations began that same afternoon in the Keep's main council chamber, a long, formal room lined with tapestries depicting Ashford's history, its rulers, its victories, its losses. Lyra sat beside her father, as protocol required given her position as heir, though she said little during the opening exchanges, watching Cassius Thorne carefully for any sign of the deception her instincts continued to suspect. He spoke eloquently about wanting to distance his leadership from his predecessor's actions, about rogue members responsible for the border attack 11 years earlier, about his genuine desire to see peace restored between the territories for the benefit of both packs' futures. His words were careful, measured, difficult to argue against directly, and Lyra found herself growing increasingly frustrated at how reasonable everything sounded, despite the persistent unease sitting heavy in her stomach. That evening, after the first day of formal discussions concluded without any specific commitments made, Kian found her walking the eastern wall alone, needing space to process everything she had witnessed. "How did it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Smoothly," she said, though the word carried little comfort. Too smoothly, honestly. Everything he said sounded reasonable, careful, practiced. I kept waiting for some crack in the performance, some moment where his real intentions slipped through, and it never came. "That doesn't mean there isn't something underneath it," Kian said. "Skilled liars are skilled precisely because they don't let anything slip." Over the following days, as negotiations continued, Kian quietly pursued the concerns that had first troubled him, speaking carefully with members of Holomir's delegation during the informal hours between formal sessions, using the easy, unassuming manner that had first drawn Lyra to trust him, the same quality that made people underestimate him, dismiss him as unimportant, an Omega with no real standing worth paying careful attention to. It was precisely that underestimation, he explained to Lyra one evening, that allowed him to move through the delegation's periphery largely unnoticed, gathering small pieces of information that nobody thought worth guarding closely around someone they considered insignificant. "People talk more freely around Omegas," he told her, sitting together in the quiet corner of the library they had claimed as their own over the past 2 weeks, especially Omegas from small, unimportant territories. "Holomir's guards barely notice me standing nearby when they're discussing their own concerns among themselves." "What have you learned?" Lyra asked, leaning forward with careful attention. "Small things, mostly," Kian admitted. "But small things that add up to something troubling." One of the younger guards mentioned, in passing, that their real orders come from someone other than Cassius Thorne, someone who remains at Holomir rather than traveling with this delegation. Another mentioned that the peace treaty language being drafted includes provisions for Holomir patrols to move freely through certain sections of Ashford's border territory, provisions that seem oddly specific for a simple peace agreement. "Free movement through our borders," Lyra repeated slowly, understanding beginning to dawn with a cold clarity. That would give them access to positions they'd otherwise never be permitted near. "Exactly." Kian's expression had grown serious, the easy warmth replaced by focused concern. "I don't have proof yet of anything more sinister than opportunistic treaty language, but combined with everything else, the sudden peace offer, the increased patrols across multiple territories, the specific provisions buried within careful diplomatic language, I don't think this treaty is what it claims to be." Lyra felt the old fear returning, sharper now, sharpened by concrete suspicion rather than simple unease. "We need to tell my father," she said. "We will," Kian agreed. "But we need more than suspicion, and overheard fragments before we bring this to the council. Your father's advisors already lean toward accepting this treaty, given the trade benefits it promises. We'll need something concrete enough to overcome that inclination. Over the following 2 days, Kian continued his quiet investigation, moving carefully through the delegation's periphery, listening, observing, piecing together fragments of information that slowly began forming a clearer, more troubling picture. Lyra assisted where she could, using her own position to review the draft treaty language more closely than the Council's initial casual approval had allowed, finding, buried within pages of careful diplomatic phrasing, the exact provisions Kian had first mentioned, worded subtly enough that a less careful reading might have missed their true significance entirely. "This isn't a peace treaty," she told her father privately, laying the draft document before him along with her own careful annotations. "Look at Section 12. It grants Holomere patrols authorized movement through the northern border territories, specifically the region surrounding the old watchtower ruins, the same position that oversees our most vulnerable defensive gap." Her father studied the document with growing alarm, his earlier careful optimism giving way to the same suspicion that had haunted Lyra since the messenger's first arrival. "How did you notice this?" he asked. "Kian noticed it first," Lyra admitted. "He's been quietly asking questions among their delegation these past several days. What he's learned suggests Cassius Thorne isn't operating independently. Someone else remains at Holomere, directing this entire arrangement. Someone using this peace treaty as cover for something far more calculated than genuine reconciliation." King Draven sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of the revelation slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a grim, focused resolve. "If this is true," he said carefully, "we cannot simply confront them directly. Not without proof solid enough to withstand scrutiny, and not without risking whatever true intentions lie behind this arrangement accelerating before we're prepared to respond." "Kian believes we still have time," Lyra said. "The treaty signing isn't scheduled for another 5 days. That gives us a window to gather more concrete evidence, and to prepare our own defenses quietly, without alerting Holomere's delegation that we've grown suspicious of their true intentions." Her father studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a grudging respect replacing the earlier worry that had colored so much of their recent conversations about Kian. "This Omega of yours has done Ashford a considerable service," he said quietly. "I confess I underestimated him, the same way it seems Holomere has." "Everyone underestimates him," Lyra said, unable to keep the quiet pride from her voice. "It's their mistake to make, and it's proven useful, this time, that they continue making it." That evening, as preparations began quietly within the keep to verify Kian's suspicions and strengthen Ashford's defenses without alerting Holomere's delegation, Lyra found him waiting in the courtyard, the weight of what they had uncovered settling heavily between them. "Your father believed you," Kian said, relief evident in his voice. "He believed us," Lyra corrected gently. "Whatever happens next, we uncovered this together. I won't let anyone forget that, especially not the council members who spent the past 2 weeks looking straight past you as though you were nothing more than an inconvenient guest lingering too long at the keep." Kian's expression softened at her words, something warm and grateful passing behind his careful, watchful eyes. "Whatever Holomere is planning," he said, "we'll face it together. I meant what I told you before, Lyra. I'm not going anywhere. Not while there's still a threat hanging over you and everyone you're responsible for protecting." She reached for his hand, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his grip, and together they walked back into the keep, carrying the weight of what they had discovered, and the growing certainty that whatever Holomere truly intended, they would need every ounce of courage and cleverness they possessed to meet it head-on. The days that followed passed in a careful, controlled tension, the keep's outward routine continuing as though nothing had changed, while quietly, beneath the surface, King Draven's most trusted guards began reinforcing the northern watchtower and strengthening patrols along the border region the treaty had specifically targeted. Lyra spent those days moving between the training yard and the council chamber, her focus sharpened by the knowledge that whatever Holomere intended, it would likely arrive without warning, disguised beneath the same polished diplomacy Cassius Thorne had displayed since his arrival. Kian continued his quiet observation of the delegation, though he grew more careful now, aware that too much attention might alert Holomere's guards to exactly how much Ashford had already uncovered. On the 4th night after their discovery, he came to find Lyra in the library, his expression carrying an urgency she had not seen from him before. "Something's changing," he said, closing the door behind him. "I overheard 2 of their guards discussing a message that arrived tonight, something about moving the timeline forward. They mentioned the Northern Watchtower specifically, and something about ensuring the position remains, in their words, undefended when their people arrive." Lyra felt her pulse quicken. the careful calm she had maintained over the past several days cracking under the weight of immediate danger. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, I think, though I couldn't be certain of the exact hour." They seemed to be planning something that would coincide with the formal treaty signing ceremony, using the distraction of that event to move people into position without drawing attention. They went immediately to King Draven, who received the news with the same grim resolve he had carried since first learning of the treaty's hidden provisions. He called his most trusted commanders together that same night, and by morning, a careful plan had been assembled, one designed to appear, from the outside, exactly like the treaty signing ceremony Hollowmere expected, while quietly positioning Ashford's own forces to respond the moment any hidden movement toward the northern watchtower began. Lyra insisted on being present when the plan finally moved into action, despite her father's initial reluctance to place her anywhere near potential danger. "I've spent 11 years being protected from every possible risk," she told him, standing firm in the council chamber the morning of the ceremony. "I won't hide now, not when this threat is aimed at undoing everything Ashford has worked to rebuild since the last time Hollowmere attacked us. I want to help defend what's mine to protect." Her father studied her for a long moment, old worry and quiet pride tangled together in his expression, before finally nodding his agreement. "You'll stay close to the guard formation," he said, "and close to Kian, if he insists on remaining as well." "I do insist," Kian said simply, standing beside her with the same steady resolve he had carried since first uncovering Hollowmere's true intentions. The formal signing ceremony began that evening exactly as Cassius Thorne's delegation expected, torches lit throughout the main courtyard. Both parties gathered in careful diplomatic formation, while scribes prepared the treaty documents for signature. Lyra stood near her father, watching Cassius Thorne's practiced composure with new understanding now, recognizing the careful performance for exactly what it was, a distraction designed to hold Ashford's attention, while whatever true plan Hollowmere had assembled moved forward elsewhere. It was Kian who first noticed the signal, a subtle shift in posture among several of Hollowmere's guards positioned near the courtyard's edge, a coordinated movement that broke away from the formal gathering just as the treaty documents were being presented for signature. He caught Lyra's eye, a silent confirmation passing between them, and together they moved quickly toward her father, who had already noticed the same suspicious movement, and signaled his own hidden forces into position. What followed happened swiftly, Ashford's guards intercepting Hollowmere's advancing party near the northern watchtower before they could establish any meaningful foothold, the element of surprise firmly in Ashford's favor thanks to the careful preparation Kian's discovery had allowed. Cassius Thorne, confronted directly by King Draven with evidence of the coordinated deception, offered little resistance once it became clear his plan had been thoroughly anticipated, his careful diplomatic composure finally cracking under the weight of exposed betrayal. "You were never planning genuine peace," King Draven said, standing before the Hollowmere Alpha in the courtyard, torchlight flickering across both their faces while Ashford's guards secured the remaining delegation members without incident. "My hand was forced," Cassius admitted quietly, something bitter and resigned entering his voice. "There are those within my own pack who never accepted my leadership, who preferred the aggression of my predecessor's ways. This treaty was meant to buy them the access they needed to weaken Ashford before turning their ambitions toward my own position. I agreed to it, because refusing would have cost me everything, but I take no pride in what almost happened here tonight." Whether his explanation carried genuine truth or simply the desperate reasoning of someone caught in failure, King Draven did not immediately decide, though he ordered Cassius Thorne and his delegation held under careful guard while the full details of the conspiracy were investigated properly. Lyra stood beside Kian in the aftermath, watching the careful, controlled chaos of guards securing the courtyard, of her father issuing calm, measured instructions despite the danger that had so nearly succeeded. The fear that had gripped her chest since Kian's warning the previous night slowly began to ease, replaced by a quiet, exhausted relief. "We did it," she said, turning to face him fully. "We did," Kian agreed, reaching for her hand. "Though I imagine your father's council will have a great deal to discuss in the coming days, regarding exactly how thoroughly they underestimated this threat." "They underestimated you too," Lyra said, "just like everyone else has, since the moment you arrived here. I hope tonight finally changes that." Kian looked at her for a long moment, something quietly hopeful settling into his expression despite the exhaustion evident in his posture. "I don't need everyone to see me differently," he said. "I only needed you to, and you did that from the very first night we met." She smiled, the warmth of the moment settling over her, despite the lingering adrenaline of everything that had just occurred. Around them, the courtyard slowly returned to order, guards escorting Hollowmere's remaining delegation toward secure quarters, while while King Draven conferred quietly with his commanders about the careful diplomatic and military response the coming days would require. As the immediate danger passed and the courtyard began to empty, King Draven approached the pair, his expression carrying a weight of gratitude that Lyra had rarely seen from him in such open form. "You saved this territory tonight," he said, addressing Kian directly for the first time with genuine, unguarded respect. "Both of you did, but your instincts, your quiet investigation these past weeks, gave us the time we needed to prepare properly. I owe you a debt I don't know how to properly repay." "You don't owe me anything, Your Majesty," Kian said. "I only did what needed doing, for people I've come to care about deeply these past weeks." King Draven studied him a moment longer, something shifting visibly in his expression, the last of his earlier reservations finally giving way to genuine, hard-won respect. "Nonetheless," he said, "Ashford remembers its debts, and I suspect this territory owes you rather more than a moment's gratitude." Lyra watched the exchange with a swelling warmth in her chest, understanding, for the first time since Halamir's delegation first arrived at their gates, that whatever came next for her and Kian, the foundation between them had proven itself far stronger than politics or standing, or old fears about legacy and duty. They had faced real danger together, and emerged not simply intact, but bound more closely than any careful courtship ever could have managed on its own. A month passed before Ashford Keep fully returned to its ordinary rhythms, the investigation into Halamir's conspiracy, concluding with careful diplomatic arrangements that stripped Cassius Thorne of much of his authority, while allowing genuine reformers within his pack to establish new leadership, less inclined toward the aggression of his predecessor. King Draven handled the entire affair with the measured wisdom that had earned him his people's respect over 11 years of rule, and by the time autumn's last leaves fell from the trees surrounding the keep, a fragile but genuine peace had finally taken root between the two territories, this time without hidden provisions or calculated deception buried beneath careful diplomatic language. Through it all, Kian remained at Ashford, his presence no longer questioned or quietly resented by the council members who had once dismissed him as an inconvenient distraction, unworthy of the king's daughter's attention. Word of his role in uncovering Halamir's true intentions had spread quickly through the keep and beyond, carried by guards and servants who had witnessed his quiet courage firsthand, and the whispers that once followed him through every hall now carried a very different tone, respect replacing the old pity and suspicion that had first colored his arrival. Lyra found him one crisp morning in the same training yard where their friendship had first deepened weeks earlier, working through archery drills that had grown genuinely skilled over the course of his extended stay. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her, appreciating the steady confidence that now marked his posture, so different from the careful, guarded stillness she remembered from that first gathering feast. "You've gotten good," she said, announcing her presence. "I had an excellent teacher," Kian replied, lowering his bow with an easy smile, "though I suspect I'll never quite match your skill." "Give it time," she said, settling onto the low wooden fence at the yard's edge. "You've surprised me before." He set his bow aside and joined her, the familiar warmth between them settling into something even steadier now, tempered by everything they had faced together over the past month. "Your father asked to see me this morning," he said, "before you arrived." Something in his tone made her sit up straighter. "What did he want?" "He offered me a formal position within Ashford's council," Kian said, watching her carefully for her reaction. "An advisory role, recognizing the service I provided during the Halamir affair. He said Ashford could use someone with my particular instincts, someone capable of noticing what others overlook." Lyra felt a rush of genuine joy at the news, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly before hearing the rest of what he had to say. "That's wonderful, Kian. What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to think about it," Kian admitted. "Not because I doubted the offer, but because accepting it would mean remaining at Ashford permanently, and I wanted to be certain that decision was made for the right reasons, not simply because it offered convenient proximity to you." "And what did you decide?" He reached for her hand, the same steady gesture that had grounded her through so much uncertainty over the past month. "I decided that I want to stay," he said. "Not because of convenient proximity, though I won't pretend that isn't part of it. I want to stay because these past weeks, working alongside your father's council, training in this yard, walking these grounds with you, have felt more like home than Rivermore has in years. I want to stay because I've fallen in love with you, Lyra, somewhere between that first feast and everything that followed, and I don't want to spend my life anywhere that doesn't include you in it." The words landed with a warmth that spread through her entire chest, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with the emotion she had been carefully guarding for weeks. uncertain whether voicing it aloud might somehow break the fragile, precious thing they had built together. I have for longer than I probably should admit. Kian's smile widened, something deeply relieved passing behind his eyes, as though he too had been carrying the same careful uncertainty about whether his feelings were returned in equal measure. Then I suppose Ashford has gained a permanent advisor, he said, and I've gained considerably more than I ever expected to find. The night I decided to sit beside a stranger who looked like she needed company more than anyone else in that entire hall. Best decision you ever made, Lyra said, laughing through the last of her tears. Without question, he agreed. That evening, King Draven hosted a smaller gathering within the keep, ostensibly to celebrate the successful resolution of the Hollowmere affair, though Lyra suspected her father had other motives as well, watching with quiet satisfaction as she and Kian moved through the hall together, no longer relegated to separate tables or careful distances, but standing openly beside each other as guests offered genuine congratulations rather than pitying glances. Near the end of the evening, her father rose to address the gathered guests, his voice carrying the warm authority that had guided Ashford through 11 steady years of rule. Tonight, I want to formally recognize someone who arrived at our gates as a stranger, and who has since proven himself an invaluable friend to this territory, and to my daughter, he said, his gaze finding Kian across the hall. Kian Voss, formerly of Rivermore, has agreed to join Ashford's council as an advisor, and I extend to him our territory's full welcome and gratitude. The hall erupted into genuine applause, a stark contrast to the careful, suspicious silence that had greeted Kian's arrival weeks earlier. Lyra watched him accept the recognition with quiet grace, the last shadows of his old rejection finally giving way to something steadier, something earned through his own courage and quiet perception, rather than granted by fate or circumstance beyond his control. Later, as the gathering wound down and guests began drifting toward their quarters for the night, Lyra found herself standing with Kian near the same terrace where she had once sought solitude during that first difficult gathering, watching the stars scatter across the clear autumn sky. "Do you remember what I told you that first night?" Kian asked, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders, "about choosing someone, rather than waiting for fate to decide." "I remember," Lyra said, leaning into him. "I meant it then, and I mean it even more now," he said. "Whatever happens next, whatever challenges Ashford faces in the years ahead, I choose you, Lyra. Not because fate demanded it, and not because of scars or standing or any of the things people once used to measure either of our worth. I choose you because you're the bravest, kindest person I've ever known, and because sitting beside you that first night remains the best decision I've ever made." Lyra turned to face him fully, the scarred side of her face catching the moonlight without the old instinct to hide it, without the familiar shame that had followed her for 4 long years. "Then I choose you too," she said simply, "for exactly the same reasons." They stood together on the terrace long into the night, two people who had once sat alone in crowded rooms, now standing side by genuine choice, the weight of old rejection and old scars finally settling into something they no longer needed to carry as burdens, but simply as part of the long, difficult, ultimately rewarding path that had led them both to exactly where they were always meant to be.